In 1974, people went to the beaches without fear. They carelessly splashed with their friends, surfed thoughtlessly, and swam with reckless abandon. Then, the following summer, everything changed. Steven Spielberg was not the first person attached to direct Jaws, the tale of a northeastern town terrorized by a great white shark. Spielberg almost gave up on the project himself for fear of becoming known as the Sharks and Trucks director. And he was right to have that reservation, as the project made his name synonymous with the big-budget, high-thrill ride that would shortly be known as the Blockbuster. Jaws is pretty universally considered to have kicked off the Blockbuster era, but what aspects of this film do we see in the waves of movies that this behemoth shark inspired? Join me in shark and spoiler-infested waters that we call the Cinema Circle. To read a brief description of Jaws, it appears to be a B-movie, a tense creature feature sprinkled in with spectacle. It does borrow from B-movies from the 40s and 50s, and it also takes from the 1950s approach of allowing films to have social commentary in their subtext. While it's a B-movie on paper, on screen, Jaws gets the A treatment. Many blockbusters that followed were similarly inspired by cheap and/or pulpy films from the previous era, but now they were being given more significant budgets and thought. Whereas B-movies of the studio era were often disposable afterthoughts in the minds of their backers, these movies were headliners. The release of Jaws was unusual in a number of ways. Universal bought TV ads to promote the film, which was not common practice yet, nor was the unusually wide release. While today, blockbuster movies will open in seemingly as many theaters as possible, the mentality of the day was to open in fewer theaters to ensure a longer run. See, if, for instance, Jaws wasn't available in your town, you would have to go to the next town over to watch the movie. And by the time you went over there, the population of that town had already seen the movie, thus it's at that theater longer. They realized that they could have their cake and eat it too. Jaws opened in 409 theaters and set a record with its $7 million opening weekend. It would go on to gross $472 million worldwide, which is well over $1 billion when adjusted for inflation. This opening showed distributors and studios that they could do more business quickly with a wide release, and in the case of Jaws and Star Wars which followed it, there were more than a few repeat viewings. The blockbuster mold that Jaws set also helped reaffirm to studios the benefits of making a movie relevant to the so-called four quadrants, men and women over and under 25. But how does Jaws set that mold? The principal characters are all three white men, and well over 25. There is hardly a person darker than a vanilla wafer to be seen, unless you count a sunburned beachgoer, and the film only barely passes the Bechdel test because of this scene.
I just want to know one simple thing. When do I get to become an islander?
Ellen, never. Never. You're not born here, you're not an islander. Maybe that's it.
I can only speak for cisgender men myself, but as I was under 25 whenever I first watched this movie, and I'm over 25 now, if you can believe it, I can say that its appeal to me has changed with time. When I was young, I was titillated by the idea of a shark horror movie. Then the fact that it wasn't completely bombastic made me feel sophisticated. I think that for many young people, they want to see content that makes them feel adult, and Jaws fits that mold perfectly. It has philosophy, but it still has all the blowing up a shark fun that teenage boys crave. For women, I think the appeal is mostly the same. I did ask a few female identifying friends about their relationship to Jaws, and they widely reported the same. One female cinema lover proclaimed that Jaws is a perfect movie and heralded its take on bureaucracy in the first half and toxic masculinity in its second. I think it's perhaps antiquated to think that men and women have to enjoy different movies, that they can't enjoy the same ones. And I also think that a blockbuster like Jaws sort of transcends those parameters. At this point in history, there also wasn't massive representation for women, people of color, LGBTQ people, or other non-cis white moviegoers. These groups were making truly amazing films at this time, don't get me wrong. Barbara Loden's Wanda, John Waters' Pink Flamingos, and Bill Gunn's Ganja and Hess come to mind. But these films were not widely available and ran mostly on independent art house or midnight circuits. The Rocky Horror Picture Show was released alongside Jaws in 1975, but spread largely via word of mouth instead of Jaws' unprecedented campaign. But I think to say that anyone besides straight white men enjoying this film is really limiting to the film's true genius. It touches on things that speak to all of us. It broods on the fear of the unknown, and it puts us in a position to examine what we'd do if there was a threat to our community. Jaws very famously implies more than it actually shows. This film falls more in line with Hitchcock films of the previous era than the exploitation fare that had taken over the cinemas in the decade preceding 1975. Partially, this is due to technical and budgetary constraints. But there's no denying that Spielberg was incredibly influenced by studio era films. Jaws is rated PG. Granted, today it would probably be rated PG-13. There are lady parts. But it set the mold for movies being in sort of that sweet spot, attractive to older viewers, but also accessible to younger ones. There's blood in the film, but it's not bloody. It's tense, but it's not intense. There's horror, but it's not horrifying. I think this restraint allows the film to focus more heavily on its human elements. It's impossible to talk about Jaws without talking about its score. I'm not going to play any of it because I don't want YouTube to get mad at me. But you know it goes something like this, it goes something like this. It's permeated the culture and become synonymous with the looming threat of any kind. The Jaws theme's success serves as a sort of metaphor then of how impactful the film was. If you're watching this video and have never seen Jaws, you're at least aware of it, perhaps in more detail than you know. You might also recognize lines like, "You're gonna need a bigger boat." Jaws brought sharks into our consciousness, paving the way for Shark Week. If you think twice before stepping in the ocean, you likely have Jaws to thank. This permeation of the culture also set the tone for blockbusters to come. John Williams' scores are perhaps more indicative of blockbuster filmmaking than any visual could ever hope to be. Others have emulated his genius in their efforts, creating sweeping, bold compositions that contain earworms fit to have you coming back for more. Watching Jaws today is sort of a surreal experience. I watched it just for funsies last year about this time, so May, June of 2020, and watching this movie where they were discussing possibly closing the beach or keeping them open to support the economy amid the closures and reopenings and uncertainty that was 2020 was really something. Jaws is a smart movie because it doesn't lay out cut and dry who is right or wrong. Okay, the mayor is wrong. But the town does need tourism to thrive, and we've all seen over the last year the way that taking time away from a business can have lasting effects. But the movie smartly pits these economic needs against the human lives in danger every moment the shark is on the loose. It plays perfectly with the paranoia of knowing a shark could be lurking in any corner of the sea and grapples with the real human consequences of not heeding the warnings. In some ways, Jaws almost plays like a slasher. There's an early death to introduce the killer, escalating tension, and the kills leading to a final standoff. But most slashers don't have scenes like this. Through this lens, Chief Brody acts sort of like Dr. Fauci, listening to experts, in this case Hooper, to make advice to the public that will save lives. Like Fauci, however, Brody can't take these actions that he would deem necessary all on his own. He finds himself caught between what's right and what the people think is best for them, their greater will. And while he does get confronted for letting that boy die, he also gets this response from the crowd when he announces that he wants to close the beaches. I think it was weirdly alarming and comforting to watch this movie when I did. In times that felt unprecedented, this movie was able to show that though the circumstances may be different, history in many ways was just repeating itself. Jaws is split essentially into two halves. The first half is the aforementioned section at and around the beach. It's tense and taut and full of psychological as well as shark-inspired thrills. The second half sees the three men at sea trying their best to kill the titular fish. the film turns to sort of an action-packed character study. I've mentioned it more than a few times, but compared to other blockbusters, Jaws feels pretty restrained, and I think that restraint is the film's true genius. Many have offered different interpretations of the film. I encourage you to watch or rewatch it and make meaning for yourself. For me, I think it's hard to deny the idea of a barely seen threat as an allegory for the many shadowed threats of the early 1970s. The US had been through the Watergate scandal, and there was an air of mistrust. The film then depicts a man of the law determined to make a difference, blowing up that unseen terror and restoring order. It's also hard not to read anything from this period through the lens of the Cold War. The shark threatened to close down the beaches as lucrative moneymakers, just as the perceived communism threatened capitalism and the American way of life. The only way to fight that lurking force is through a combination of order, represented by Brody, knowledge, represented by Hooper, and blue-collar workers, represented by Quint. I think that whether patrons were looking for it or not, the subtext of this film also helped with its success. There was much catharsis in seeing the unthinking menace get its comeuppance. There was much reward in seeing that sacrifices made by everyday people like Quint were meaningful. There was joy in knowing that there was a community against the evils of the world. As I mentioned, some have found the film to be a takedown of toxic masculinity in the male ego. Quint is hyper-masculine in a way that leads ultimately to his death. He also is a working class man who resents Hooper for his inherited wealth. Hooper, meanwhile, signals that wealth and education are connected. Brody then lies somewhere in the middle. He's left the urban landscape of 1970s New York to try to actually make a difference in his community, only to be confronted by a force of nature he can't control. He is a masculine protector who finds himself over his head and swimming against greater currents. What's your relationship with Jaws? Love it? Hate it? Think it's overrated? Leave a comment down below and let me know. If you'd like more movie and comedy content, follow me or this channel on Twitter or Instagram. Thank you so much for watching and for loving movies. If you've liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more introspection on cinema. You can also share this video with a friend or consider supporting me on Patreon, the link in the description. Thanks so much again. Be safe. Watch a movie.